What starts as a routine arrest spirals into something far more dangerous when a corrupt sheriff and his deputies try to silence the wrong woman. They think she's just another face in a janitor's uniform, easy to overlook, easy to crush, but they don't know who she really is, and by the time they find out, it's too late. This isn't just a fight for truth, it's a war against a system built on fear, silence, and power abused for too long. What follows is a story of courage, betrayal, and justice that refuses to die no matter how many times they try to bury it. Trust me, you won't believe where this story ends or how far she's willing to go to take them down. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss a second of what's coming. The town of Fairpoint always seemed like the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen. Neat lawns, white steeples, flags that never stopped waving in the breeze, but Veronica Wells knew better. She moved like a shadow through the courthouse corridors, pushing a mop bucket that squeaked every fifth step, wearing the cheap polyester coveralls of the county's cleaning crew. Her back was hunched just enough to appear tired but not weak, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of a faded cap, scanning every corner without drawing attention. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor wax and old wood, the kind that held onto whispers, secrets, and sweat from 100 years of trials. Every morning before the clerks arrived, she was already there, sweeping the same worn tiles and listening not just to footsteps or laughter, but to power speaking when it thought no one important was near. The first time she heard Sheriff Carter Duane's voice echo off the marble walls, she paused her sweeping ever so slightly. Man like Grant thinks he can sue the county, he scoffed from inside. Judge Maynard's chambers, his southern drawl soaked in disdain. Hell, he's lucky we let him die slow. Veronica kept sweeping, but her heart slowed to a deliberate beat, her left hand brushing the recorder beneath her waistband, pressing it on. She knew she was standing in the eye of something rotten, something bigger than just one corrupt cop. It was in the way the deputies laughed too hard, in the way court documents vanished from the filing room, and how no one ever mentioned the veteran with the missing eye, unless it was to mock his attitude. Veronica said nothing. She hadn't come to speak. She'd come to listen, to record, to remember. The weight of pretending to be small pressed down on her heavier than the mop bucket she dragged behind her. She felt it in her spine each time a lawyer brushed past her like furniture in her jaw, when Deputy Vicks called her, "Hey girl," without ever looking her in the face. Some days it took everything she had not to flinch when someone slammed a door or raised their voice too close, but she'd been trained for this kind of silence. She'd led operations on foreign soil and dismantled human trafficking rings across state lines. Now here she was, director of the FBI, posing as a janitor in a town that thought justice belonged only to the people who looked like them. Veronica had chosen Fairpoint not just because of the patterns of complaints and missing reports, but because it was personal. Her father had passed through this town in 1963 and left with broken ribs and a silence he never explained. She was 6 the first time she saw that scar on his chest, and 10 when he finally told her who gave it to him. That old story lived inside her like a pilot light, quiet, steady, waiting for fuel. Now, decades later, she was back to settle the fire properly. She didn't need anyone's permission. She just needed proof. One afternoon, as she scrubbed the hallway outside the break room, she caught a sliver of conversation. Duane again, laughing with Vicks. "You hear about that girl who tried to pull FOIA requests," he said, stuffing something in his mouth, probably a donut. "Bitch got a flat tire, then a warning shot through her mailbox." "You believe in coincidence, Marla." The deputy's voice was low but sharp. "Not in this town." Veronica's grip on the mop handle tightened, her knuckles white under the gloves. The hallway was quiet, save for the hum of the soda machine and the fluorescent buzz overhead, and yet the air felt heavier than it had all day. She exhaled, slowly controlling her breath, forcing her muscles to stay relaxed. In her ear, her training instructor's voice from years ago echoed faintly. "Don't blink when you're scared. Blink when you're ready." That night, she sat alone in her motel room on the edge of town, the kind of place with peeling wallpaper and vending machines that never worked. She transferred the audio files to a secure drive, listening back to the scratchy voices and muffled laughter, cataloging every name, every date, every threat. Her hands were steady, but her jaw clenched. This wasn't just about Leonard Grant anymore. This was a system. A culture, a routine. The camera on her burner phone caught her reflection in the dark television screen, hair pinned under the janitor's cap, circles under her eyes, but her expression clear. She hadn't come to be a savior, she'd come to expose the lie. In that quiet room with the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood, Veronica let herself feel something. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, the weight of responsibility. She thought of her team in D.C., watching her progress from afar, waiting for her signal. She thought of Leonard Grant lying in a hospital bed somewhere, his story already dismissed as exaggeration. And she thought of her father, what he'd looked like after Fairpoint tried to break him, and how he'd lived with that silence. She whispered into the recorder, "You didn't get to break him, and you're not going to break me." Outside, the streetlight flickered once, then held steady. Inside, Veronica Wells closed the laptop, lay back on the narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling. She was in the lion's den now, but the lion didn't know she'd brought matches. And for the first time since arriving in Fairpoint, she allowed herself a thin, quiet smile. The fire started just after midnight, when the sky hung low with heat, and the air in Fairpoint felt like a damp cloth pressed too tightly against the skin. Veronica had been watching the courthouse parking lot from her usual perch at the back of the bus depot, her janitor's uniform folded neatly in her lap and her eyes fixed on the glow of a single security light blinking above the exit door. She'd just finished transferring a batch of recordings to a separate drive, one she planned to mail in the morning, when her burner phone buzzed once in her coat pocket. No caller ID, no message, just a short burst of static, and then silence. Something about it felt off. She stood, brushed the dust from her pants, and started walking. By the time she reached Maple and 12th, she could already smell the smoke. It wasn't the gentle curl of a backyard grill or the crackle of dry leaves burning. It was thick, bitter, almost metallic, like burning plastic and old varnish. The wind carried it low and fast, and her steps quickened instinctively. Around the corner, past the rusted chain-link fence that lined the back of Wallace & Sons Auto Shop, she saw the first flicker of orange reflected in the windows. Her chest tightened as she broke into a run, gravel skidding beneath her shoes, the heat growing stronger with each step. When she turned the final corner, the sight nearly stopped her heart. The law office was engulfed, flames licking the rafters, windows already shattered, thick black smoke boiling upward like it was trying to choke the sky itself. And in the yard, 20 feet from the front door, a woman knelt on the grass, screaming, her hands clawing at the dirt, her voice raw and animal. It was Lisa Greer, the lawyer's wife, her nightgown torn, her hair tangled, and her eyes wide, with a kind of devastation that made the world go silent for a moment. Veronica's legs moved on their own. She rushed forward, crouched beside her, gripped her shoulders, tried to ground her in that chaos. "Lisa," she said, firm but not loud, "where's Maya?" The woman couldn't speak at first. She just shook her head, gasping through tears and smoke. Then she lifted one hand and pointed toward the second floor, where a soft blue flicker of what had once been a child's nightlight still glowed weakly behind cracked glass. Veronica didn't think. She pushed herself up, sprinted toward the porch, but a blast of heat knocked her back before she could reach the stairs. The flames roared hungrily, like they recognized her and wanted her too. She stumbled, coughing, shielding her face, and realized it was already too late. The fire trucks didn't arrive for another 7 minutes, though it felt more like 70. By then, the roof had collapsed, and the child's window had gone dark. The crowd gathered fast, neighbors in slippers, deputies in trucks, some filming, most just staring like they were watching a movie they couldn't pause. Veronica stood at the edge of the street, her body trembling, her fists clenched, and the smell of burning insulation clinging to her like guilt. Sheriff Duane arrived in his cruiser just as the hoses hissed to life, and he didn't even glance at the wreckage. He stepped out slowly, adjusted his belt, and walked over to one of the deputies with a voice too casual for a man who'd just lost a member of his legal opposition. "Gas leak?" he asked, not waiting for a reply. "These old buildings just go up like dry pine." His words slid over the crowd like oil on water, calm, smooth, practiced. Veronica stared at him from across the street, watching the way he avoided Lisa's screams, and how his eyes kept scanning the faces, looking not for sympathy, but for control. He caught her watching, and for half a second their eyes met. She didn't blink. He did. Later that night, when the fire was just a steaming skeleton and the crowd had mostly scattered, Veronica walked alone past the caution tape and into the alley behind the office. She moved carefully, stepping over charred wood and shattered glass, guided only by the pale light of a half-moon and the hiss of cooling metal. Near the back door, something glinted. She knelt and brushed away the ash. It was a matchbook, cheap red, stamped with Fairpoint Sheriff's Auxiliary Benefit. She turned it over with gloved fingers and felt the deep throb of something shift inside her. That's when she knew. This wasn't about fear anymore. This was declaration. This was what happened when truth got too close. Not a warning, no warnings come with words. This was a response. A message sent not in ink or voice but fire. And if they were willing to kill a child to protect whatever was festering beneath that courthouse, then Veronica knew she'd underestimated the stakes. She made her way back to the motel just before dawn, the horizon bleeding orange behind the ridge like the fire had followed her home. In the mirror, her face was streaked with soot and her hair smelled like smoke. She sat on the edge of the bed, turned the matchbook over again, and opened it. Only one match was missing. The rest stood straight, untouched, like teeth in a clenched mouth. Veronica didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there for a long time, feeling the silence settle in the room like dust. Her hands rested in her lap, still steady, but her chest ached like it had forgotten how to breathe. There were no words in her head, only images. Maya's nightlight flickering behind glass, Lisa's mouth open in soundless horror, Dwayne's smirk in the firelight. It wasn't grief she felt, not yet. It was the unmistakable pull of something old and primal. Not rage, not revenge, purpose. By the time the sun crested the tree line and sent its weak light slicing across the motel floor, Veronica Wells had already dressed, packed her gear, and slid the drive containing the recordings into a padded envelope marked for a P.O. box in Arlington, Virginia. She added the matchbook and a short note in block letters. This wasn't an accident. She sealed it, pressed it flat with her palm, and tucked it under the floorboard near the window. The air was still thick with ash, but her mind had never felt clearer. Out on the street, people moved with the stiffness of shock. No one made eye contact. No one said a word. And above it all, the courthouse stood untouched, its white columns casting long shadows across the square like sentinels guarding a lie. Veronica looked up at the flag flapping in the breeze, still proud, still waving, and thought how strange it was that something could burn so thoroughly and yet leave so little behind. She turned and walked down the sidewalk, the weight in her chest shifting no lighter but more certain. There was no going back now. Whatever line had once separated investigation from war had burned with the child in that house. And though the fire was out, the heat still lingered in her bones, waiting. The sun had just begun to stretch across the rooftops of Fairpoint when the squad cars rolled into Leonard Grant's neighborhood, like a procession of authority, their engines low and steady their presence, a message. It was too early for most people to be awake. And yet behind half-drawn curtains and cracked blinds eyes watched the slow advance with a tension born not of surprise but expectation. The kind of tension that lives in the bones of people who've learned the hard way that justice rarely comes wearing a badge. Veronica stood at the corner of Pine and Melrose, one hand in her pocket, the other gripping a steaming paper cup of burnt motel coffee. She was dressed in her janitor's uniform, just another early riser catching a moment before work. But her eyes followed the cars closely, her body angled just slightly toward the commotion, her entire being leaning in. Leonard had seen war, the kind that stains your skin with sand and your soul with silence. He was 62, black tall shoulders, slightly hunched from shrapnel damage, and still walked with the pride of a man who once stood between enemy fire and his squad. His house sat like he did, worn, proud, and still standing. Veronica had met him once briefly under the pretense of asking for directions while sweeping the courthouse steps. He'd recognized her eyes even if he didn't know her name. "You watching them, or are they watching you?" he'd asked, and she had smiled without answering. That morning, Leonard had barely made it to the porch with his cane when the first shout rang out. "Hands where I can see them." Now the lead deputy, Marla Vicks, was already halfway up the walk, her stance wide, one hand hovering above her holster, the other waving like she was swatting a fly. Leonard blinked against the rising sun, slowly raising his hands as his cane clattered to the wood beneath him. "Is there a reason you're trespassing on my morning?" he asked, his voice clear, low, and dry with disbelief. Vicks didn't answer. She just reached out, grabbed his wrist, and yanked. He stumbled, catching himself on the frame of the door. "Hey, I'm a disabled vet," but the words were barely out before her knee met his gut, folding him in half. A second deputy rushed in from the side, tackling him down. The sound of his body hitting the steps was dull and hard, like dropping a sack of wet concrete. Veronica didn't move, not yet. She just watched, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing slightly behind the rim of her cap. Around her, the street began to fill, neighbors in robes, people holding phones, but nobody shouting, nobody stepping forward. Silence isn't consent, she thought. Sometimes it's just survival. Resisting arrest, Vix said loudly, as she placed a boot on Leonard's back, her voice theatrical for the benefit of the growing crowd. Suspect matched the description of a burglary suspect, possible, armed and hostile. Veronica saw the glance Vix shot toward the bystanders as if daring someone to object. One woman across the street clutched her toddler tighter. A man in gym shorts backed slowly into his house, closing the door with a soft click. Leonard groaned, his cheek pressed to the wood, blood beginning to bead at the corner of his mouth. That was when Veronica's hand moved not to intervene, not yet, but to press a small button hidden beneath the seam of her waistband. A secure signal transmitted silently to a listening post nearly 200 miles away, letting someone somewhere know that Fairpoint had just crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. The action took less than a second, but in her mind it rang like thunder. Vix pulled Leonard up roughly, twisting his arms behind him with more force than necessary. "You should have known better," she muttered close to his ear, her voice a sneer. "You don't sue this town and walk away clean." Leonard didn't respond. He simply looked up, his one good eye scanning the crowd, and for a moment it landed on Veronica. She didn't blink, didn't nod, just held his gaze for a beat longer than a stranger should, and in that glance she offered something stronger than a promise: recognition. The deputies shoved him into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed. The siren chirped once, not in urgency but satisfaction. The crowd began to dissolve as quietly as it had formed, people pretending to be late for work, for breakfast, for anything else that could justify their silence. Veronica remained still until the taillights disappeared around the corner, and only then did she release the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her coffee was cold now. She dropped it into a trash can, turned on her heel, and began walking back toward the courthouse. The streets were waking up now. Dogs barking in backyards, an old woman sweeping her stoop, a pickup truck backfiring 2 blocks over. Everything looked normal again, but nothing was. In her pocket, the recorder was still running, capturing the fading echoes of cruelty delivered with a badge and a grin. She passed a pair of deputies parked near the corner store. One of them, a young man with a crew cut and cigarette tucked behind his ear, gave her a quick once-over but didn't say anything. She nodded slow and measured the way the invisible do when they want to stay that way. Inside the courthouse, the air was too cold, the way government buildings always are, as if temperature alone could sterilize injustice. Veronica returned to her cart, picked up the mop, and began the rhythm of work again. Sweep, soak, ring, glide, while behind her echoes of laughter rolled from the break room where Vix had no doubt returned to gloat. She imagined Leonard in a holding cell, now his ribs sore, his dignity bruised but intact. They hadn't broken him yet, but they would try. She paused for a moment near the vending machine, its hum filling the silence between footsteps. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, neutral, quiet, forgettable. She studied that face and thought about the line she'd crossed today, the invisible threshold between gathering evidence and becoming a part of it. This wasn't about observation anymore. This was about strategy, about timing, about knowing when to strike. And as the distant clang of a cell door slammed shut somewhere behind concrete and steel, Veronica Wells stood with her mop in hand, invisible in plain sight, and knew with absolute certainty Fairpoint thought it had control, but it had just started a war it didn't even know it was in. The sky above Fairpoint was thick with humidity that night, the kind of oppressive southern air that clung to skin and soaked into lungs, making every breath feel like a slow negotiation. Veronica Wells moved quietly through the wooded stretch behind the courthouse, her boots barely making a sound on the moss-covered ground, the shadows swallowing her whole, as she followed the narrow path that snaked behind the property lines and led toward the town's western ridge. She wasn't carrying her mop tonight, no janitor's keys on her belt, no plastic name tag that spelled Valerie, just a small audio recorder in her back pocket, a pair of high-resolution binoculars tucked inside her jacket, and the kind of steady silence that only came from years of training and more than a few hard-earned scars. She reached the edge of the bluff around 10, crouching low behind a rotted tree stump that overlooked a clearing just beyond the county line, a place the town forgot existed, except during hunting season when white men in pressed camouflage would gather around the fire pit and pretend they still lived in the days when their names alone carried consequence. But tonight there were no shotguns or hunting dogs, no thermoses full of coffee. Tonight, the clearing buzzed with low voices, the glow of truck headlights casting long shifting shadows across the dirt, and the unmistakable rhythm of people speaking like they believed they would never be heard by the wrong ears. She lay prone on the ridge, pressing the binoculars to her eyes, her breath shallow and slow, counting the figures below. 6 men, 1 woman, all white, all wearing clothes that cost more than a year's worth of rent in the trailer parks just down the hill. Sheriff Dwayne stood off to the side, his arms crossed the toes of his boots, digging into the soft earth, as if grounding himself in the lie he'd built from the soil up. The woman Judge Regina Maynard held a manila folder in one hand and pointed at a map unrolled on the hood of a black SUV, her voice clipped and firm. Veronica clicked the recorder to life, letting it run as she focused on their mouths, their gestures, the tone threaded through each pause. "This stretch here," Maynard said, her hand tapping the map like she was ordering a meal, "is ripe. We code it, blight, we condemn it, and the state's redevelopment fund covers the rest. The folks living there can fight it all they want. None of them have lawyers who last more than a month around here." One of the men chuckled, the sound short and mean. Veronica didn't blink. She shifted slightly to get a better angle, her legs starting to cramp, but her body otherwise still, her mind cataloging every word like beads on a wire. Sheriff Dwayne leaned in, flicking ashes from a cigarette onto the map like they were nothing more than loose threads. "What about Grant's house? He's still sitting on that corner lot and he's loud." The man next to him, a developer Veronica recognized from an article about a failed mall project outside Baton Rouge, grinned. "You let me handle that," he said. "1 phone call, and he'll be lucky if the pipes don't burst while he's in jail. Once he's out, we make him an offer he can't refuse, or else the county starts finding code violations in places he didn't know had codes." Laughter rippled around the clearing again, low and satisfied, the sound of wolves' fat from the kill. Veronica gritted her teeth, willing herself to stay calm. This wasn't new, not the greed, not the cruelty, but hearing it laid out so plainly, so casually, like ordering a new fence or repainting a porch, made her stomach churn with a cold fury. They weren't just exploiting legal systems, they were weaponizing them, turning zoning laws and redevelopment grants into tools for erasure. And not just any land, black land, ancestral homes, churches, community gardens. Pieces of memory passed from mother to daughter, grandfather to grandson. She shifted again, wincing as a rock dug into her hip, but she didn't move to brush it away. The pain grounded her, kept her in the moment. The meeting continued for another 15 minutes, long enough for her to record details, names, dates, addresses, budget allocations buried in shell company invoices. When the group finally dispersed, leaving behind half-empty coffee cups and tire tracks in the dirt, Veronica waited until the last taillight disappeared behind the bend. Then she crawled backward down the ridge, using her elbows to slide through the brush, her breath coming fast, now that the danger had passed, but her mind already 5 steps ahead. She knew exactly what she had. She just didn't yet know who she could trust to help her hold it. Back at the motel, the air conditioner rattled in the window like an old man trying to cough out a confession. Veronica sat cross-legged on the bed, the recorder in front of her headphones snug over her ears as she played the audio back twice, then 3 times, transcribing every word in a notebook that would later be torn into strips and mailed to separate P.O. boxes in 3 different cities. She didn't trust cloud storage, didn't believe in coincidence, and had learned long ago that the safest backup wasn't a file, it was a paper trail built so carefully that even fire couldn't reach all of it at once. She paused halfway through the second listen, rewinding the section where Maynard said, "None of them have lawyers who last more than a month." Her jaw tightened. That was how they'd done it. Not with laws, but with fear, with threats, with buried court motions, and mysteriously vanishing public defenders. They didn't need guns when they had judges and deeds, and the slow death of bureaucratic suffocation. Veronica closed her notebook, gently ran one hand down her face, and let herself feel the weight of it. Not just the recording, not just the conspiracy, but the truth that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a system. And tonight she'd seen its architects in the flesh. She leaned back on the mattress, her arm draped across her eyes, and exhaled slowly, letting the sound dissolve into the hum of the machine in the window. The room smelled faintly of bleach and cheap soap, and outside the town slept like it always had, wrapped in a blanket of denial and indifference. But something had shifted. Not in the air or the laws or the headlines. In her. There was no longer any question about how far she was willing to go. Not after hearing how easily they plotted to erase people's lives over cups of gas station coffee. Veronica Wells didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel clever. She felt burdened, but it was a weight she chose. A weight she would carry until the right people were brought down, and the right truth was brought to light. And as the first birds began to sing against the blue of the breaking dawn, she reached for the second notebook, the one with no names on the cover, and began writing down everything she remembered because some lies needed to be broken word by word before the silence ever got the chance to win. The morning after the cabin meeting, Veronica returned to the courthouse just before 6, her movements measured and unhurried, her expression unreadable behind the mask of routine. She swept the lobby like she always did, slow circular motions that left a faint trail of lemon-scented cleaner behind her, the only trace she'd ever been there. No one looked at her twice, and that invisibility was both blessing and burden, powerful in its usefulness, but heavy in its silence. The recording from the night before sat safely on a microdrive sewn into the inner lining of her boot, but even that knowledge didn't ease the weight pressing against her chest, a quiet pressure that had begun the moment she saw those men plotting over coffee and maps, and had grown heavier with each step back toward this building. She caught fragments of conversation in the hallway, jokes, complaints about paperwork, the scrape of boots across tile, and every word reminded her of the casualness with which cruelty operated in this place. Her mop bucket clanked softly as she pushed it past the break room where Vix was laughing with a group of deputies, her voice sharp and full of mean confidence. Veronica didn't stop. She kept moving, head down, shoulders rounded just enough to seem disinterested, but her ears absorbed every syllable. "Guy like Grant should have kept his mouth shut," Vix said, tossing a paper cup toward the trash. "You don't bite the hand that built your town." The men around her laughed, not because the joke was funny, but because power doesn't need to be clever to be obeyed. Veronica turned the corner, her pulse steady, but her grip tightening on the mop handle. She felt the need rising in her like a low-tide, anger, grief, urgency, but she knew better than to let it break the surface. Not yet. Her job wasn't to confront. It was to outlast, to gather, to strike only when the evidence was undeniable and the exit was clear. But that patience was being tested now, stretched thinner with every smirk and every lie spoken like scripture in these halls. And then that evening, the retaliation came, not subtle, not strategic, but brutal and loud and unmistakable. It started with the sound of sirens in the distance, too many too fast, echoing across the rooftops like a warning. Veronica had just stepped out of the grocery store near the edge of town when she saw the orange glow rising above the treetops, too large to be a car fire, too violent to be anything but intentional. She dropped the bag in her hand, the apples rolling into the gutter, and ran. By the time she reached the intersection near the old Baptist church, she could see the smoke thick, black, and churning like a living thing pouring from the windows of Reggie Tate's community office. The barber shop he'd converted into a makeshift organizing center was already collapsing, its roof caving inward as the fire chewed through the wood beams and paint-choked walls. People screamed on the sidewalk, trying to hold each other back, some holding phones, others just covering their mouths in shock. Reggie stumbled out the front door, coughing hard, his jacket torn, one arm around an older woman who was sobbing into his chest. His eyes met Veronica's through the haze, and for a split second she saw the same thing. She felt a flash of disbelief, followed by a wave of bitter confirmation. "They did this," he said, voice, hoarse eyes, wet but fierce. "You know they did." She nodded once, no words needed. Across the street, standing beneath the shade of an old elm tree, Sheriff Duane leaned against his cruiser with his arms folded across his chest, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Deputy Vix stood beside him, a toothpick in her mouth, her boots muddy, her stance relaxed in a way that said she already knew no one would be asking the right questions. Veronica's stomach turned. The crowd hadn't seen them yet, hadn't noticed the way Vix casually flicked a lighter between her fingers before slipping it into her pocket. But she had. That night, after the flames had been smothered and the fire trucks had cleared, after Reggie had gone silent and the crowd had scattered in fear, Veronica sat alone in her motel room, replaying every frame in her mind. Her hands trembled as she scrubbed soot from her jacket, her fingernails lined with ash, her eyes red from smoke and anger. The fire wasn't just a warning, it was a shift in the game. It was proof that they'd seen her move and weren't afraid to answer with violence. And worse, it was working. The fear was spreading. People were pulling back, whispering instead of shouting, wondering who would be next. Reggie hadn't said another word since the fire. He'd gone from organizing protests to sitting alone on the steps of the burned-out shop, staring into the ashes like they held a question he no longer wanted answered. Veronica knew that look. She'd worn it once herself after a field agent she trained was found dead in a hotel room with a suicide note forged in his handwriting. She knew what it meant to feel the weight of responsibility for a fire you didn't start but couldn't stop. The next morning she returned to the courthouse, early, sweeping the same floors she'd swept 100 times before. The deputies passed her like they always did, without notice, without care, and yet she felt their eyes lingering just a second too long. In the break room, the laughter was louder than usual, and she knew it was meant for her even if her name was never spoken. As she pushed her mop past Dwayne's office, she saw him through the glass, seated at his desk, flipping through property maps, a smirk still lingering like a stain on his face. He looked up and met her gaze, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Fairpoint, he looked directly at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. He held the stare for just a beat, then looked away as if to say, "I know who you are now." And in that moment she understood what the fire had really been, a message, not just to Reggie but to her. She was no longer invisible. She had stirred something too dangerous to ignore, and now Fairpoint was watching. The courthouse was packed that morning, tighter than any day Fairpoint had seen in years, the kind of crowd that didn't just show up for jury duty or zoning disputes, but came because they smelled blood or victory or something close enough to both. The pew-like benches groaned under the weight of people, some leaning forward with narrowed eyes and clenched jaws, others sitting back with smug arms folded and legs crossed in casual disdain. The murmur of low conversation rolled across the room like static under a radio station, rising and falling as the bailiff called the room to order. But no one truly hushed until the heavy double doors creaked open and the defendant was brought in. Leonard Grant, handcuffed, bruised, still limping from the assault no one in uniform would acknowledge. Veronica stood just outside the courtroom, dressed in her faded blue coveralls, the name Valerie stitched in cursive across her chest, a mop in one hand and a cloth in the other. To anyone watching, she was simply doing her job, wiping down the wooden railing, checking the hinges on the courtroom doors. But her eyes scanned every face, every flick of movement, every subtle shift in body language. Sheriff Dwayne sat at the prosecution table, back straight, uniform, crisp, his smirk never far from the surface. Deputy Vic stood by the entrance like a dog on a leash, taut, alert, waiting for a reason to pounce. The judge, a pale man with silver-framed glasses and a voice that trembled with age more than justice, entered with little ceremony. "Court is now in session," he announced, though his voice barely cut through the heat and tension hanging in the air like dust on sunlight. Leonard raised his head slightly, his eyes swollen but unafraid, and scanned the room until it landed on Veronica near the wall. Their gaze locked only for a second, but it was enough. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, and she returned it with the faintest lift of her chin. The moment came faster than she had prepared for, not because she wasn't ready, but because no amount of planning could truly anticipate how it would feel to step forward and dismantle an entire facade in one breath. She moved before her heart had a chance to protest, crossing the room in a single measured walk, each footstep deliberate and soft against the polished floor. The judge looked up, startled by her movement, about to speak, but she raised her hand calmly and stopped just before the gallery rail. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear and calm, eyes scanning the room, "not for attention but for acknowledgement. Before you proceed, I need the court's attention." A ripple went through the room. Sheriff Dwayne's smile faded, slightly replaced by something colder, harder to name, recognition, without understanding, like he was staring at a ghost who suddenly remembered who they were. The judge adjusted his glasses, squinting at her. "Miss, this is highly irregular." "Who are you two?" "My name is Veronica Wells," she interrupted, still composed, her voice strong but not raised, "and I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Silence hit the room like a dropped gavel, sharp and irreversible. Someone gasped audibly. A chair scraped. Even Vix shifted her stance slightly like a dog, unsure if it had misjudged the shape of the threat. Veronica reached into her uniform slowly, deliberately, and produced a slim ID wallet. She flipped it open, held it up for all to see, then placed it on the judge's bench with the quiet authority of someone not here to ask for permission. "I've been undercover in this town for 6 weeks," she continued, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "I've gathered evidence of systemic corruption, racial targeting, land theft, abuse of power, and falsification of legal documents, all orchestrated or condoned by Sheriff Carter Dwayne and his department. People weren't breathing. Even the ceiling fan, always creaking, seemed to pause mid-turn. "I have audio recordings," she said, reaching for a small device tucked into her back pocket. "Video files, transcripts, witness accounts, all admissible, all verified, all damning." She walked to the prosecution table, not rushing, and set the recorder down beside Dwayne, who hadn't moved. His hands were still folded in front of him, but his jaw had gone tight, his eyes narrowed, and his shoulders no longer leaned comfortably back. They were stiff, alert, calculating. "You have the right to remain silent," she said, staring at him directly now. "I suggest you start practicing." Dwayne smirked again, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. "This is a stunt," he muttered, voice low but cutting. "Nobody in this town's gonna believe a word of it." She pressed play, and then his voice filled the room, not hers, not a witness, not a second-hand account, but his. Clear, cocky, cruel, talking about planting evidence, about scaring witnesses, about letting the right kind of people have the right kind of land. The courtroom listened. Every word burned like a flare in the dark. No editing, no distortion, just truth undressed and undeniable. People turned to look at each other, some in disbelief, others in rage. The silence grew heavier, tighter, until the judge finally cleared his throat, his voice barely audible. "We'll need to verify." "It's already been verified," she replied gently, handing him a folder of credentials and signatures from the Bureau's legal branch. "I'd advise you to order Sheriff Dwayne into custody. Immediately." The judge looked down at the documents, then slowly raised his hand. "Bailiff," he said, voice trembling, "place the sheriff under arrest pending further review." And that was when it shifted. Dwayne stood slow and steady, his face no longer smug but set like stone. "You're making a mistake," he said, but it wasn't to the judge, it was to the room. "All of you." The bailiff hesitated, looking to the judge again, then stepped forward, reaching for the cuffs. Vix growled something under her breath but didn't move. Dwayne didn't resist. He just smiled, eyes on Veronica, as if he was memorizing her for later. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, a strange quiet fell again, like the room wasn't sure whether it had just witnessed justice or the first crack in something more dangerous. Veronica didn't blink. She collected the recorder, nodded once to Leonard, then stepped back into the gallery, as calmly as she'd entered. Her heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from release, like something long held had finally been set free. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with heat and uncertainty, the town already buzzing with the news that the sheriff had been arrested in open court by a woman no one had even realized was watching them. And yet, Veronica didn't pause to gloat or breathe it in. She stepped onto the sidewalk, lifted her face toward the sun, and let it warm her skin for the first time since arriving. The lie had cracked, and the truth at last had made a sound loud enough to be heard. By dusk, the heat had begun to break, but the tension in Fairpoint only thickened the air heavy, with a kind of stillness that warned more than it calmed. The courthouse doors had barely shut behind Sheriff Dwayne in handcuffs before the town began to shift, first in murmurs, then in movement like a slow ripple across the surface of deep, unsettled water. Veronica Wells didn't stay to hear the gasps or the speculation. She knew what came next, had seen it before in towns that swore they'd never turn until they did. The illusion of control had cracked in public, and now the machinery of the old order would spin faster, meaner, more desperate. She walked alone down Main Street, her janitor's uniform peeled away and tucked into a canvas bag, slung over her shoulder, leaving her in dark jeans and a plain black t-shirt that bore no name, no badge, and no expectation. The sun bled orange against the tops of the cypress trees, casting long shadows over the storefronts where white patrons whispered behind drawn blinds and locked doors, their glances lingering just long enough to register unease. Behind her, she heard the buzz of phones, the chirp of radios, the low growl of police cruisers idling near the station, not in service, not in silence, but in watchfulness. She didn't need confirmation to know the backlash had begun. By the time she reached Reggie Tate's house, a modest, shotgun-style home with peeling paint and a porch that sagged gently under the weight of years, word had already beaten her there. His front yard was quiet, but inside, the murmur of voices clashed with the faint crackle of a police scanner someone had turned down low. Veronica stepped through the door and into a room filled with faces. She recognized not by name but by presence, people who'd marched, who'd handed out flyers, who'd shown up even when it wasn't safe to do so. They turned toward her as one, and for the first time in weeks, she saw not suspicion but hope, fragile, flickering, but present. Reggie stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the street like he expected someone to come tearing around the corner any minute. "You really did it," he said, not smiling, not yet. "You brought him down." Veronica shook her head slightly, her voice even. "I opened a door," she said. "We still have to hold it open long enough to walk through." There was a beat of silence, the kind that carries the weight of truth, and then someone in the back murmured, "So what now?" The question hung in the air, heavy and trembling, as though everyone had wanted to ask it but didn't want to be the one to say it aloud. Veronica exhaled slow and deep, then crossed the room and lowered herself into a worn armchair with cracked vinyl edges and a cushion that sighed beneath her. Now she said quietly, "We wait for the system to try to erase what just happened. And we don't let it." They didn't need her to explain what that meant, because that night, Fairpoint began to hum with the sound of pressure, the kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself but slides through telephone lines, across diner counters, into whispered conversations at gas stations and church steps. Deputies doubled their patrols in black neighborhoods, cruisers parked outside schools and grocery stores, their headlights left on just long enough to be noticed. Signs went missing, flyers were torn down. And by morning, the sheriff's supporters, those who'd never needed to say his name aloud to show their loyalty, began to emerge, like roots pushing up through concrete. The backlash was subtle at first. A teacher suspended for discussing the case in her civics class. A mechanic let go after donating to Reggie's defense fund. A young mother warned quietly that her Section 8 voucher might be reevaluated if she kept attending rallies. Veronica watched it unfold from every angle, quiet punishments wrapped in polite smiles, retaliation carried out by people who claimed fairness with one hand while gripping a knife with the other. She'd seen this before in border towns and inner cities in small counties that swore up and down they were post-racial, right up until a black man asked for equal protection under the law. But she also saw something else, something slower, quieter, but stronger. She saw Reggie return to the remains of his burned-out barber shop, sweeping the ash from the sidewalk like it was dirt after a storm. She saw Leonard Grant walk out of the jail with his head high and his cane planted firmly, refusing help as he descended the courthouse steps. She saw Mrs. Varnell, who ran the church pantry, set up tables in the park with handwritten signs that said, "We're still here even when the city revoked her permit." And for the first time since she'd stepped into Fairpoint, Veronica felt the needle shift, not toward peace, not toward triumph, but toward presence. Real, stubborn, unshakable presence. A refusal to disappear. Still, the night wasn't done. Just after 11, as she sat reviewing evidence in the back room of Reggie's house, the windows shook from a deep, echoing boom, distant but close enough to feel. The lights flickered. Outside, sirens wailed, not from fire trucks or ambulances, but police cruisers moving fast, engines high tires, screaming as they tore through the neighborhood. She bolted upright, grabbed her pack, and ran toward the front door, heart pounding in that tight, rhythmic way that felt like memory, trying to warn you of something you already knew. The fire was at the protest office. A temporary space they'd set up in a borrowed community center where people had been organizing marches, holding town halls, making signs that said things like "Justice for Fairpoint" and "We believe Leonard." Now it was ablaze, the smoke rising like a signal flare, the flames hungry and bright and wrong. A crowd gathered, but no one moved too close. Deputies blocked the road. One of them, young, white, baby-faced, stood with his hand on his holster, lips curled in something too close to a grin. Veronica didn't speak. She didn't shout. She just pulled out her phone, held it high, and started recording. A woman beside her whispered, "They don't even care we're watching." Veronica kept her eyes on the fire and said, "That's why we don't stop." Later, long after the fire had burned down to embers and the crowd had thinned into silence, she sat on the curb with her elbows on her knees, sweat drying on her arms, the glow of what once was flickering across her eyes. Someone behind her asked, "You still think we can win this?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the ashes, at the soot that painted the sidewalk like shadow, and then she said almost gently, "I think we already are." And in that moment, surrounded by smoke sirens and the quiet resilience of a town refusing to be erased, Veronica Wells believed it. The sun rose over Fairpoint the next morning like it always had, casting a soft amber light over the rooftops and empty sidewalks, trying to pretend nothing had changed. But even the birds sounded cautious, their songs shorter, less confident, as if nature itself was pausing to see which direction the town would tilt. Veronica stood by the window of her motel room, one hand resting on the curtain, the other wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She wasn't watching the sunrise because it was beautiful. She was watching it because it reminded her that no matter how much pain a night held, the world kept moving forward with or without permission. The streets outside were quiet, too quiet for a town that had just watched its sheriff arrested on live camera and then watched the flames consume the first real protest in a generation. Veronica could feel the silence pressing against the glass, a silence that didn't come from peace but from fear curling back in on itself. She knew that quiet well. It was the kind that came just before the storm, when everyone was holding their breath, deciding whether to fight, flee, or fade into the background. Down by the courthouse, makeshift barricades had been put up overnight, not by protesters, but by the sheriff's loyalists, deputies, local militia boys, and good old boys in denim jackets who'd found their moment in chaos. They stood with crossed arms and rifles slung casually over their shoulders, sipping from thermoses and exchanging words without volume. Their presence a silent warning the town may have cracked, but they weren't planning to let it fall. Their trucks were parked in wide circles, flags flying from the tailgates, American, Confederate, and homemade banners stitched with vague slogans like "Local First" and "Protect Our Way." Across town on the south side, the energy was different. On porch steps and inside small churches, people gathered quietly in folding chairs, speaking low but firm, their voices laced with weariness and resolve. Grandmothers brought covered dishes not for celebration, but because food was the only thing that still felt safe to offer. Young men paced the sidewalks, arms folded across their chests, casting long looks at every passing car. Mothers held their children a little tighter, speaking softer, reminding them to stay close, to be careful to keep the door locked when they went to the store. No one said the word war, but everyone felt its shape in their mouths, its weight in the way they moved. Veronica crossed through both parts of town that day, first walking slowly through the courthouse square, where a few shop owners nodded without warmth, their gazes filled with questions they didn't dare ask out loud. "You started something," one of them muttered as she passed. Not angry, not grateful, just unsettled. She didn't stop, she didn't respond, because she hadn't come to make friends or play savior. She had come to uncover the rot. And now that it was out in the open, people were realizing that truth wasn't the clean, quick fix they had hoped for. By late afternoon, the divide had taken on a shape you could see from the church steeple, one half of the town, standing firm in old power, armed and loud. The other side gathering strength not through weapons but through presence, through knowing the fight wasn't over and maybe never would be. Veronica met Reggie in the basement of the community center, where folding chairs formed uneven circles and handwritten signs leaned against the walls. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, but when he saw her, he managed a small nod. "They're trying to scare us quiet," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Photos of every person at the protest. Deputies going door to door pretending it's for community safety. Veronica flipped through the images slowly, her jaw tightening as she recognized faces, young, old men and women, all black, all suddenly marked. "They're creating a list," she murmured, her voice low. Reggie didn't need to respond. The truth was already in the air. They talked for another hour, not just about the evidence or the strategy, but about the feeling, how the fear had changed. It wasn't the paralyzing kind anymore. It was sharper now, edged by clarity, by the knowledge that they had nothing left to wait for. "We either push back," Reggie said, "or we get pushed out." "Again," Veronica nodded, and for a moment there was nothing left between them but that quiet understanding shared by people who had stopped hoping someone else would fix it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the old cotton fields that framed Fairpoint like a broken fence, the town itself seemed to hold its breath again. At the center of that silence stood Veronica, her hands in her pockets, her gaze fixed on the courthouse steps, now barricaded with plywood, and men who still thought justice was something they could contain. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel safe. But she did feel ready for whatever version of truth or violence would come next. The day ended not with a speech or a bullet, but with the sound of hymnals drifting from the back room of a church where someone had lit candles against the dark. Veronica paused outside the window, listening to the words, the trembling voices rising together, not in defiance, but in memory. They weren't singing because they believed everything would be fine. They were singing because sometimes survival is louder than silence. And as the last note faded, swallowed by the cicadas and the wind, Veronica closed her eyes and let the weight settle. Not as a burden but as a reminder that even in a town split straight down the middle between those who wanted change and those who feared it, there were still voices willing to rise, not to win, but simply to be heard. The night Reggie Tate was attacked, the moon was hidden behind a blanket of thick, unmoving clouds, the air so still that even the insects seemed to pause mid-buzz, as if the whole town knew something was about to break. Veronica had been in the back room of the diner on Pine Street, tucked in a booth by the window with a cup of lukewarm tea and a stack of handwritten notes she'd been cross-checking against public land records. She was reviewing a parcel number tied to one of the judge's shell companies when the phone buzzed softly against the table, one short vibration, followed by a silence that made the room feel too large for its walls. The message was short. They got Reggie. Front of his house. Bad. It didn't say who sent it, and she didn't need to ask. She was out the door within seconds, the screen door of the diner slamming behind her, her boots striking hard against the cracked sidewalk as she moved fast through empty intersections and past shuttered shops. Fairpoint was always too quiet after sundown, but tonight it was the kind of quiet that carried an edge like every porch light, and drawn curtain was holding its breath, hoping this time the violence wouldn't spill onto their side of the street. As she rounded the last corner near Reggie's block, she saw the flash of red and blue lights bouncing off the white paint of his fence, the shadows of uniforms, swaying like branches in a storm. They weren't paramedics. They weren't fire. They were deputies, 3 of them standing casually near the hood of a cruiser, while Reggie lay curled on the concrete beside his porch, one hand clutching his ribs, blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. His other hand was stretched toward the wooden steps, fingers barely brushing the edge, as if he'd almost made it home, almost reached safety. Veronica slowed her steps as she approached, her eyes scanning every angle. No weapons drawn, no crowd gathered, just the smell of sweat, asphalt, and fear rising in the thick air. One of the deputies turned toward her, his face unfamiliar, but his stance all too predictable, and said, "You got business here, ma'am?" She didn't answer at first. She walked past him, crouched beside Reggie, placed a steady hand on his shoulder and whispered, "I'm here. I've got you." His eyes fluttered open, the pain swimming just beneath the surface, but even through the blood and bruises he managed to whisper, "They said this was for showing my face." His voice cracked on the last word, and it landed in her chest like a blow. Veronica looked up slowly, her gaze cold, calm, and deliberate. "He needs medical attention," she said. "Now." The deputies didn't move. One of them smirked and leaned back against the hood of the cruiser. "Dispatch is backed up," he said. "Might be a while." The words were casual, but the malice underneath them burned like oil, just waiting for a match. Veronica didn't blink. She reached for her phone and called the hospital, directly identifying herself by title, not cover, her voice clipped and professional. "You'll send someone now," she said, "and if you have to pass a blockade to do it, you tell them to call Washington." 10 minutes later, an ambulance arrived, its sirens oddly muted, like even the emergency crews had learned to keep things quiet in this town. Reggie was lifted gently onto a stretcher, his breath shallow, his grip weak around her fingers, but he didn't let go until they wheeled him into the back and closed the doors. Veronica stood in the street after they left, the taillights disappearing into the curve, and felt the weight of every eye watching from behind curtains and blinds. Not one door opened. Not one porch light flicked on. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the edge of her bed, arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the hum of the motel air conditioner as it kicked in and out, barely fighting off the rising humidity. Her mind replayed the scene again and again, not just Reggie's body on the sidewalk, but the ease with which those deputies had watched it happen. Not angry, not ashamed, just amused. She knew then that this wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was about punishment. They were retaliating openly now, no longer hiding behind paperwork or procedure. They were showing the town what happened when someone stood too tall or talked too long. By sunrise, she had already packed her garage. Not to run, but to move. Quietly, quickly, she headed to the safe house across town where she had stashed duplicate drives, extra IDs, and backup recordings. Her hands moved with the steady rhythm of someone who'd done this before because she had. And yet there was something different about this time, something more personal, more raw. Reggie wasn't just a source or a partner. He was a symbol of what this place could be, if people stopped being afraid. And now he was lying in a hospital bed because she hadn't moved fast enough. Later that morning, she met with 2 organizers under the shade of an old oak tree behind the elementary school. The kids inside were watching cartoons while their teachers prepared the day's lesson plan, but outside strategy was unfolding in whispers. "They're escalating," one of them said. "People are scared." Veronica nodded. "Good. Fear wakes people up. It's what you do next that counts." They laid out maps, marked potential safe routes identified, which buildings had back entrances, which homes had basements large enough to hide more than a few people. It wasn't just about protest anymore, it was about protection, about planning for the worst, while hoping for something just good enough to live through. And as she walked back toward the heart of town, her eyes met those of a girl, no older than 10, sitting on her porch steps, braiding a plastic doll's hair with quiet concentration. Their eyes locked for a moment, no smile, no wave, just that steady, uncertain stare children give when they can sense something big is happening, but don't yet know what it means. Veronica gave a nod, a small one, just enough to say, "We're still here. We're still trying." And when she turned the corner, her shadow stretching long and narrow across the broken pavement, she felt something settle, not peace, not yet, but a steel certainty that they were far from done and far from beaten. The air over Hollow Creek had a strange static heaviness that morning, as if even the wind didn't want to move too fast, for fear of setting off something that had been holding itself back for too long. Veronica stood beneath the edge of a billboard off Highway 12, half shaded by the rusted steel frame and hidden behind a row of broken vending machines. Her clothes were damp with sweat and dirt, her arms still wrapped tight in gauze from the scrape she got diving under a fence the night before. Around her, the early traffic on the highway moved like nothing had changed, like the world beyond this town was still turning in its predictable rhythm, unaware of the war, unspooling block by block on cracked streets and courthouse. Steps. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the last burner phone she hadn't destroyed, turning it over in her hand before pressing it to her ear. "It's time," she said, her voice low, steady, but edged with something raw like a nerve exposed to air. On the other end, the reply came after a long breath. "You sure about this?" It was Dante Brooks, the former Marine who'd stayed in the shadows for months, watching, organizing, waiting. Veronica didn't hesitate. "I'm done watching them rewrite the rules and burn the paper after. We hit them tonight." The plan had been simmering for weeks, first as an idea too dangerous to say out loud, then as a whisper between trusted people, and finally as a strategy drawn out on the underside of diner napkins and stashed behind church hymnals. Slade's convoy would be leaving the county courthouse around 9, headed for a meeting with private contractors who'd been funding his campaign of terror in exchange for land rights and silence. 3 SUVs, 2 unmarked cruisers, and enough weapons to secure a border. The convoy was supposed to be untouchable, shielded by law, loyalty, and fear. But Veronica had learned something dangerous about fear. It only worked when people had something left to lose. She met Dante and the others at a long-abandoned cotton mill on the outskirts of town, its brick walls scabbed with ivy, and its windows, nothing more than jagged outlines in broken frames. Inside, the smell of oil, rust, and sweat hung thick in the air as people gathered around a makeshift table built from a door set across 2 barrels. Maps were spread out across the surface, lit by the dim glow of a single hanging bulb. Dante looked up when she entered, his jaw clenched, the scar across his cheek, catching the light like a thread of silver. "Slade's running heavy," he said, nodding toward the map. "But we've got the choke point here, just past the south overpass." Veronica leaned in her fingers, tracing the curve of the road where they planned to trap the convoy. "No press, no live streams," she said. "We're not here to go viral, we're here to end it." They moved quickly once night fell, splitting into 2 teams, one to block the road with a stalled truck and smoke canisters, the other to hit the middle vehicle where Slade would almost certainly be riding. Veronica rode with Dante in the second truck, her hand gripping the rifle she hadn't used in almost 4 years, its cold weight against her thigh, a reminder that justice sometimes arrives loud and on fire. The first SUV rounded the bend right on time, headlights sweeping across the pavement like searchlights looking for ghosts. Then came the truck engine, dead hazard lights blinking in the dark like a warning no one would heed. The convoy slowed, confusion spread, radios crackled. And then, like thunder breaking the silence of a funeral, everything erupted. Smoke grenades hissed, blooming into clouds that swallowed the road. The middle SUV swerved and skidded sideways, its tires slashing against the asphalt. Veronica moved fast, the world narrowing to the sound of boots hitting pavement and gunmetal clicking into place. The driver door flew open, and chaos spilled out, shouts, gunfire, bodies scrambling for cover. She saw Slade briefly, his pale face flashing in the chaos, then vanishing behind the door of the SUV like a rat scurrying into a wall. Dante threw a Molotov at the rear vehicle, flames exploding across the hood, forcing the deputies to scatter into the ditch. "Move!" Veronica shouted, her voice tearing through the noise, and they charged forward. The front vehicle peeled away tires, screaming, while the middle SUV spun out into the gravel shoulder. Veronica reached it just as the passenger door flew open. Slade lunged, a pistol in one hand, eyes wild with the panic of a man who couldn't believe the mob he used to control had turned feral. She raised her rifle, but before she could speak, Dante tackled him from behind, driving him into the dirt with a crack of bone and breath. "You think this is your town?" Dante growled, pinning him down. "It ain't been yours since the first lie you told." Slade spat, blood eyes darting like a cornered animal. "You're all just thugs," he hissed. "You're nothing." Veronica knelt beside him, lowering her weapon. "No," she said quietly. "We're the answer to every time you thought you could get away with it." They dragged him to the back of the burned-out cotton mill, chaining him inside what used to be the freight elevator shaft. No cameras, no judges, just time, and the ghosts of the people he tried to erase. It wasn't the end of the war, but it was the first real break in the machine. By morning, news had spread faster than the smoke had cleared. "Militants seize sheriff's convoy," the headlines said. "Terrorist plot against law enforcement," claimed others. But in Hollow Creek, where the soil still smelled of blood and old rust, people started coming out of their houses again. Quietly, cautiously. Like survivors stepping into the sun after too long underground. Veronica didn't celebrate. She sat alone on the roof of the cotton mill as the sun came up, her fingers wrapped around a chipped enamel mug of bitter coffee, the steam rising into air that tasted of ash and metal. Below her, the others slept in shifts or watched the road, waiting for the next move. Because there would always be a next move. She knew that now. But for a moment, just one, she allowed herself stillness. Not peace, not relief, just stillness. And as the first light painted the edge of the trees and the birds finally dared to sing again, she whispered to no one, "This is what holding the line looks like." And in that moment it was enough. In life, justice doesn't always arrive in the spotlight or to the sound of applause. It often comes from quiet people patiently enduring, who choose to step out of the shadows when the moment demands it. Veronica's story reminds us that change doesn't always begin with an election or a law. It often starts with someone who dares to say enough. For those who have lived through decades of hardship, hope, and history, this lesson isn't new, but it is always true, that silence is not always peace. That truth, no matter how deeply buried, can rise again if someone keeps the flame alive, and that no one is too small, too old, or too late to make a difference. Believe in that. Because you, our aunts, uncles, parents, and grandparents, are living proof of the power of resilience, dignity, and unshakable courage. If this message speaks to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that standing up matters no matter how long the road.